Good morning, friends, and welcome to a Hasty Podcast. I'm your cookie-eating host, Weston Hasty. You're listening to a Hasty Podcast. I'm so used to doing I'm your host, Magic Man Mo, from my main YouTube channel by the same name, Magic Man Mo, that every time I do this, it's like, what would be a word for it? It would be culture shock, but it's like platform shock, genre shock. You know, the difference between, like, I have this YouTube show that I do, but this is the podcast show. So, like, the shock of, like, swapping between the two or switching between the two and like, kind of having a different persona? I don't know if that's quite what I'm looking for. I was going to say a different persona between the podcast and the YouTube channel, which I guess is true. I don't know if that's quite exactly what I'm looking for, but yeah, a different style and a different. It's a different genre. Podcasting of genre. It's not a genre. It's a platform. It's a different medium. Yeah, sure. We'll go with medium. Makes more sense. Medium is what I was looking for. It's a different medium. Podcasting, whereas like doing YouTube is a video experience meant to be watched. Podcasting is typically an audio medium meant to be heard. So it'd be two different mediums, and then within each medium there are genres, there are platforms. So within video sharing mediums there are platforms like YouTube or Vimeo or Dailymotion or God, what else is there? Other stuff, I'm sure. And within podcasting, obviously, different platforms would be like your Spotify and your Anchor and your Apple Podcasts, etc., etc. And then within each platform, of course, you have your different genres. So that's where you're talking about, like, gaming is a genre, or fitness is a genre, or apparently on podcasting, personal journals is a genre. That's something that I feel like I contemplate. I've been doing a lot of contemplating about the podcast lately. That's what this episode's going to be about, by the way. Should I lead with that? Should I just I have so many questions. I don't know what I'm doing when it comes to podcasting. Should I just cold open, or should I lead with what you're going to experience? We do a short podcast. It's not a long podcast. So cold opens, maybe. I don't know. Maybe I should introduce what we're going to talk about so that you can decide whether or not to waste your time with this podcast before we jump into it. Today we're talking about some reflections and introspections and some thoughts that I've had about doing the podcasting thing so far after 17 episodes. This is episode 18 of the podcast, not counting the pilot. Episode 18, what I've kind of thought about doing this so far and where I see the future of the podcast going, and just some thoughts around that kind of concept is what we're doing today. And like I was saying, I've been doing some reflecting, and I've labeled my podcast as a personal journal podcast. And full disclosure, as I think about it now that I'm talking out loud, I realize that there is a fatal flaw in my reflections that I've been having. and it's a pretty obvious one. I've been thinking about that category, personal journal, because when I started this podcast, and of course named it after myself, a Hasty Podcast, the idea was that this was very much my podcast. It's like about me, for me, I guess. I don't know. It was very me-centric when I started this, as in, like, this is just an experiment. I don't know what I'm doing, but I like to talk, apparently. Apparently, I like to talk. Apparently, that's what I've learned about myself over the many years of existing. And, yeah, we'll just name it after me, and it's kind of like a personal journal diary-type podcast thing where I talk about my life. But the more we get into this, the more that I contemplate between every podcast episode that we do, the more that I think about it, the less it is about me, the less me that I talk about, the less I think personal journal as a category makes sense. But also, like, if I can only pick one genre, this is why we were talking about genres earlier. See how it all connects? If I was going to pick a genre for this podcast, what even is it? You know, sometimes we talk about Netflix shows, sometimes we talk about video games. I think those are the two biggest ones that we talk about. I guess the genre is like entertainment. But if I label myself as entertainment, does that assume that I'm the entertainment? Because I'm not the really, like, well, maybe. You can tell me if I'm wrong or right about this. I'm not really doing the entertaining. I'm not doing a podcast where I'm doing stand-up and telling you jokes. I'm not really telling you engaging dramatic stories. I don't think. Maybe occasionally I come up with something to say. But I feel like I'm not the entertainer. I'm just talking about entertainment. But I guess that would be in the genre, maybe. And this is where the fatal flaw comes in. That I just now, as I'm speaking out loud, that I think about. The fatal flaw that I've had in my reflections, now that I think about it, is that I have not bothered to do my research into what other podcasts within the genre of personal journal, or whatever this category is called, what those other podcasts do say or talk about in their podcasts. I am such a bad podcaster. I don't even listen to that many podcasts, or when I do listen to podcasts, it's based on whether or not I've discovered them on the internet somewhere, whether it's through Twitter, a YouTube recommendation of some kind, etc. That's where I find my podcasts. I don't go through platforms for my podcasts. I don't sift through Spotify looking for a platform for podcasts. I don't sift through Podbean looking for podcasts. I don't sift through platforms to get my podcasts. So when it comes to time where I'm like creating this one, I'm constantly like, I have no idea how the average podcast listener consumes podcasts, because all I have to work with is myself. And I don't imagine I am a typical podcast listener. So I don't know. I should listen to some more podcasts in my genre so that I can understand whether or not I am in the right genre. Because I was thinking about that as I was reflecting. Like, should this just be a video game categorized podcast? And I occasionally talk about other things, Netflix, etc. I don't know. Because sometimes when you can choose more than one genre, like more than one category to place your podcast into, then it would be easier to like sort of really get down to nitty gritty. Like I talk about this, and this. Great. But because we're such a varied podcast that we talk about a little bit of a few things, that if I was going to nail it down to just one thing, I'm struggling a little bit. Not that that's super uber duper important, but it is something that I've thought about. And I've thought about this podcast quite a bit as I've struggled to maintain doing this on a daily level, which made me wonder if I wanted to go to doing weekly shows instead of daily shows, because I figured that gives me lots more time to prepare episodes, right, every week as opposed to every day. But ultimately, the more I think about it, the more I realize that I have a particular insecurity that makes that option seem appealing, and possibly more so than it is, if that makes sense. I might be biased, is what I'm trying to say. When I'm leaning toward, I should just do a weekly show, I feel like my bias here is that I'm just, one, giving myself more time to procrastinate doing an episode, which means I will eventually just skip a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Eventually, there's no podcast left. Because if I do a daily podcast and I miss a day or 2 or 3, I mean, my bad. But at least, like, after we've done 100 of these, it's just a thing of the past. If you miss a couple episodes of a weekly podcast, that's weeks to months going by. Whereas if I miss a couple days, yeah, okay, whatever. Other people you can fill the void with something else to do. But also, I as I reflect too, on number 2, the second thing that I have an insecurity about is whether or not I can truly be interesting or entertaining on a daily level. And this has brought me to a number of thoughts, right? One, that how, I don't know, maybe you can relate to this or not. I don't know. How sad, question mark, how sad is it that I am concerned that I could not possibly have enough to talk about? That my life is so dull that there is nothing I could talk about for 30 minutes every single day. Like every single day, I can't find something interesting to talk about for half an hour. How? Now, maybe this isn't weird. Maybe that's not abnormal. I don't want to call anyone else out if you feel this way. If you're a potential podcaster yourself, or someone who's thought about podcasting, or maybe you just listen to podcasts. Maybe you yourself are worried with the idea that you could not possibly have something to say every single day for half an hour into a podcast-like platform, right? Because that's my concern. I'm not trying to call you out, because that's how I feel too. And in my mind, because that's how I feel, and I like to be a little bit more brutal with myself, you know, the way I talk to myself is, really, I am so boring. I am so dull that I can't come up with something to talk about every day. So when I was playing around with this idea of moving to a weekly podcast, I realized that possibly that insecurity that I could not possibly have this much to talk about was kind of poking its head out a little bit. And I had to realize that that decision was affected by that insecurity, and that if I wanted to combat that insecurity, I needed to continue to push through trying to nail down doing this daily podcast. So I have decided to continue doing a daily podcast as close to daily as I can manage. I am trying. If any of you have been listening for a while now, I'm sure, like, if you've been around since the first couple episodes, you've realized that I've missed days on this journey. I have missed days. This is what we've been doing this is episode 18, so we've been doing this for roughly 3 weeks or so. Oh, that's wild. It's wild how much time has passed already. But yeah, I've missed days. There's going to be hiccups like that. Hopefully, as I continue to get better at this and create a routine of some kind, just in general developing a better professionalism around doing this, that we can really nail down making sure that there is a dependable, stable daily podcast coming in every morning, because I don't want to be, like I say, I kind of gave myself an out by saying if I miss something, no big deal. But also, like, there's a degree of professionalism there. If any of you come to rely on my podcast every day, so or even if you listen only occasionally, but like building up a backlog, I want you to be able to depend on that being there, you know? So there is a level of professionalism that I am trying to bring to this platform. It's just very new to me. And look, Hasty is already in my name. I love to just jump into things right away. This podcasting thing, on a whim, I've already told you guys early on that I was inspired by another podcaster from More Than a Podcast, James from More Than a Podcast. That is more with 2 O's and ending in an E. Talking to him on Twitter inspired me to do a solo podcast. That is not a secret. I stand by it. And that is what happened. I listened to him doing a solo podcast like one time, and I was like, hey, I want to do that. It was a combination of I think I can do it, and 2, I really want to do it. And so we started doing it. So I just rushed into it. I didn't do research for this. Good God, man, did I not do research for this? So here we are. I'm going to continue to keep trucking. So, and it works too, because if I did a weekly podcast, I would feel more inclined to turn it into an hour or more podcast to make it feel like worth the wait, worth the buildup. Personally, it feels like if you wait a week for a half-hour podcast, it feels like it's the opposite problem of not having enough to say every day. Is it now in a half an hour, how could you possibly get everything in that possibly happened in a week? So I feel like it would have to be longer. But I do really like the idea of these brief podcasts that are short, easy to digest, and easy to like consume on a commute to work, or doing a long dishwashing session, or whatever your routine might be. A 30-minute podcast isn't too bad. So I've been pretty happy with the general decision that I've made to go into podcasting like this. Now the question becomes, more or less, like, what's the future of this podcast? What do I have in store? What do I have in mind for the future besides just stabilizing when you can expect this podcast to happen? What's the plan moving forward? It's a sip break here. The plan is an interesting one. I say that, but it might only be interesting to me. As we've hit 150 views or streams or whatever you call it on podcasting, my stat tracking thingy on Anchor tells me that it has been 150. That's pretty exciting to me, considering that this is a completely new thing to me. That's pretty exciting to me. Of course, I am now thinking, how do we expand? I've mentioned before, one of the reasons that I got into podcasting was to kind of create this morning routine for myself, to kind of give myself a creative outlet in the mornings. And I've talked about productivity and efficiency and my need to sort of do things. I think I've talked about that. My need to create things, my need to do things, my innate desire to make sure that I'm constantly working on something. I've talked about that a little bit, but one of the other reasons I was pretty excited about podcasting was because it is in this sort of field that I'm unfamiliar with. So I do a lot of YouTubing. I make YouTube videos, I stream games on YouTube, I do a lot of YouTube stuff. That's kind of like in the video field. What was really intriguing to me in podcasting was the audio field, the idea of creating an audio experience that I don't have graphics to show on screen. There's no screen for you to be looking at. It's a podcast. It's all audio. I'm not worried about doing a bunch of clipping because I do a lot of Let's Plays and video game stuff on YouTube. So you clip out a lot of like dull moments and that kind of thing. I'm not worried about clipping the audio. Interestingly enough, the way I've set up this podcast and in my style is that it's really laid back, not much in the way of editing, not in the way of much work in many ways. Of course, being able to talk on end for a length of time, some kind of length of time, is a skill in and of itself. But beyond the actual like production of the podcast, it's actually pretty easy. I record it, I upload it, I distribute it, it's done. Like it's relative to other things I've done, it's relatively easy. So, about the future of the podcast, because I'm a man who likes to make things more difficult for himself, I am constantly thinking, how do I expand this operation? Of course, one of the easiest things, the first things that comes to my mind is expanding out to different platforms. You know, finding different places to put this podcast on. But also, you know, I because I do a lot of YouTubing, I've been eyeballing my YouTube and thinking to myself, you know, as well as doing the podcasting thing, as well as doing audio, as well as doing Spotify, I could make a YouTube channel too and actually record video of me recording these podcasts. And I could create a video podcast series on YouTube. And that idea has been tickling at the back of my mind for some time now. I've been wanting to also put the podcast on YouTube for a little while now, at least just even in its audio format, you know, just put up a logo on screen or whatever, but it's really an audio focused video and having a channel dedicated to this podcast. I've been that's been tickling at my mind for a while now, and then for a little less time, but for a while now as well, I've been tickling around with the idea of also recording video and putting this up on YouTube. Man, no matter what I do, I keep trying to come up with ways to, how do I turn this into a YouTube series of some kind? So I'm thinking, as far as expanding the show, moving on through December as I continue to sort of do things more or less business as usual for December. Still trying to get into the rhythm of doing the podcast, figuring out where I want to take the podcast, what I want to talk about, etc. Throughout December, expect kind of more or less the same as we've been seeing, more or less. But as we move into 2021, which is coming soon, it'll come sooner than I could possibly imagine. I'm trying to think of ways to expand the show. I'm not a huge podcast. It's not like a lot of people listen to me, but I am always I just compulsively need to just tweak things over and over again. I like to just really keep messing with things. So I'm thinking we're going to be expanding to more platforms than what we have. To my knowledge, we are currently on 6 different platforms, I think. I've got a list of them. I've mentioned them plenty before. I'm on Anchor, I'm on Breaker, I'm on Google Podcasts, I'm on Pocket Casts, I'm on Radio Public, and I'm on Spotify. The Apple Podcasts, still struggling with that one. Don't know what's going on there. But yeah, that's where we're at with those so far. I've been playing around with the idea of getting over to Podbean. It's something that I know Alex, a buddy of mine, I think I've mentioned on the show before, a buddy of mine, Alex, uses Podbean and has definitely recommended that I put the podcast on that. I know more than a podcast that I've talked to you guys about uses Podbean. I know Podbean is a podcasting app that people like to use, and I've been hesitant to use it, mostly because if I wanted to be on Podbean daily, I would not have a free account on there. I'd have to pay them a premium for the pleasure, but I'm still playing around with that. We'll probably move into that. So, and other things as well. There are other podcasting places to go as well. So more platforms. Moving on to, in 2021, moving on to also having a YouTube channel. That YouTube channel might open. I might open that up by the end of December for at least the audio podcast and getting the backlog of what we've already done up on the channel. And then probably starting in or around 2021, we will be doing video versions of the podcast as well. There will be a link to that when it's actually set up and made. Right now, it's not. So that's kind of the future of the podcast, is more platforms, moving on to YouTube, and possibly, this is an idea that I have been having sort of tickle around in the back of my head for a very long time. It's basically the conception of the podcast is bringing on other people to the podcast in interview style sort of podcasts, bringing on guests for special hour-long episodes over the weekend. So between Monday and Friday, you can expect the usual half-hour episode with me, and then either on Saturdays and Sundays, or just Saturdays or Sundays, not sure yet, because this is December, and this is planned for 2021. On weekends, having a special hour-long version of a Hasty Podcast with guests, because I would definitely hate to waste a guest's time by joining some sort of call with me for only half an hour. I feel like that's not a tremendous amount of time to bring a guest on, and especially to really get into the nitty-gritty of talking about anything serious with that guest. So that is something that I definitely have tickling around the back of my head. It's funny because when I started the podcasting, I was really attracted to the idea because I thought, relative to the other stuff that I do, that it would be an easy thing for me to do. And the lazy part of me was like, yes, I like that. I record myself rambling for half an hour. I slap it on the internet. I call it a day. No strings attached. No serious commitment that, if this flops, that my heart would be broken over, or anything like that. And a part of me was very attracted to that idea. But the more I do this, the more invested I become in the idea, and the more that I want it to be awesome. The more that I really desperately want this podcast to be awesome. So I know this is a little uncharacteristic. It's only early December, so nailed it. Say early December instead of a specific date, just in case this doesn't air on the day that I think it will. Yeah, I'm a professional. No, I would have expected a sort of New Year's, you know how everyone does New Year's resolutions and shows and podcasts and that sort of thing right around the turn of the new year. And we'll probably do something like that at the end of the month as well. But even this early on in December, I wanted to start laying the foundations and the seeds for what I have in mind going forward on the podcast this early, so that I can start rattling that around in some of your guys' heads as well. So that if you have ideas or thoughts about anything that I've talked about in terms of the future of this podcast and what you'd like to see and hear on the podcast, you can join in on the conversation before the end of the year. The best way to do that is hitting me up on Twitter. You can tweet directly at me at Weston Hasty, or tweet anything using the hashtag Hasty Podcast. and I will see it eventually, and it can become a part of an episode, or we can talk on Twitter, etc. That's the best way to get a hold of me. I also have a Discord, which I'm thinking I'll try to post a link in the description of this podcast if you're interested in joining my Discord. But I'm thinking about turning it into a community Discord. That's like a new thing. If you're familiar with Discord at all, creating community servers is a relatively new thing that different servers can do on the platform, which basically just makes the server public and easier to find for people. And I think, because I already have a Discord, and what I do on there is already kind of along those lines. It's my YouTube-focused Discord based on my YouTube main channel, Magic Man Mo. But the plan for that Discord was always to also incorporate it into any of my other projects as well, that it didn't have to be strictly YouTube-focused. So as we're moving forward into this month and as well as into the new year, that Discord I will be opening up to anyone that listens to the podcast to also join in on the conversation over at Discord. There will be a link to my Discord in the description of this podcast if that sounds like something that's interesting to you. But if you're not into Discord servers, Twitter is where I usually hang out. So you can hit me up at those if you would like to join in the discussion of what the future of this podcast shall be. For the time being, I still definitely plan on talking about lots of more video games. In fact, tomorrow for sure, I know I'm going to be talking about at least Canarium. At least Canarium, because I need to talk about it before it swims outside of my mind. And if I have time, tomorrow will also be Hello Neighbor, but Hello Neighbor might be an episode by itself. I don't know. I'm very passionate about that, but I'm going to save it for... I'm very passionate about that game, but for reasons that you'll understand on that episode. I'll wait to explain further when we get to it. So I've got more video games coming to talk about. I've got a follow-up to my Duolingo episode that I did, because I've been doing some more of it, so I wouldn't mind talking about it as well as some other stuff. I've got some more Fiverr stuff that I can talk about. I'm behind on my BNA Netflix series club thing that I'm doing. I'm behind on that, so I do have a follow-up to that podcast episodes, because I've already done 2 episodes talking about BNA. But I'll have a follow-up to that episode in the next few days later in the week. So look forward to that coming up on the podcast. You have been listening to a Hasty Podcast. We're a little on the early side. Let's see, other announcements that I have that I can talk about before we go. If you're interested in supporting the show financially, this is, of course, you're not anything obligated to. That wasn't an English That was not an English sentence. Of course, you're not obligated to anything. But if you do feel like you would like to support the show financially, you can do so at my Anchor link down below, or you can do so on Patreon at patreon.com/Weston Hasty. And your patronage goes to supporting not only the podcast, but pretty much any of the projects that I constantly and consistently work on. One of the things that I would love to accomplish one day, this is sort of my goal. This is not just my dream, this is my goal. I want to make a living out of doing creative projects like these. I have a number of projects that I'm working on. I have, of course, the main YouTube channel that I talk about quite a bit. I have this podcast. I have a couple other YouTube channels that need a lot of work, but I'm working on them. I have a poetry blog that I also want to use to kickstart/launch my writing career, ? I don't know if that's quite the right word that I'm actually looking for, but I'd like to write stuff. I'd like to write a book. I'd like to get a freaking book self-published, because no one's going to publish my crap, but at least at least self-published. I've got some writing stuff. I've got this podcast. I've got a bunch of videos that I want to make. I've got a lot of stuff on my plate that I would like to do, and I would love to make a living being creative and sharing those projects with all of you. And the number one thing holding me back from doing that is actually just myself and procrastination and motivation and myself just being a generally terrible person for myself. But the number two The second thing holding me back the most is, of course, time. Because none of these things do earn me a living. I do work a day job, which I feel like we should do an episode on the podcast sometime very soon. I do have a day job as a sandwich artiste. And it pays my bills, all right? And I have got probably so many stories we could talk about Subway. Yes, that's right. Yeah, I could name drop Subway. That's right. Come after me. We should definitely do an episode about that very soon because we have not yet done it. And I feel like I could probably talk at length about it. It would mostly be, the reason I haven't done it yet is because it would mostly be me just complaining about customers. Because you see all kinds. I work at a Subway next to a highway. You got people coming and going. You got people day, night. I'll save it for that episode. Just understand that I've got stories. So I've got lots of projects. If that's something that interests you and you would like to support me financially, those are the ways to do it. I will have links to all of those things down below, hopefully. At the very least, if it looks like I forgot to put a link down there for some reason, check me out at my website, westonhasty.com. That is where I have links to all the different things that I do, all my different projects that I'm working on, and you can find basically anything I do from there, including this podcast. Thank you all so much for listening. You've been listening to a Hasty Podcast. I've been Weston Hasty. If you've enjoyed this, please consider sharing it with your friends, giving it a follow on whatever platform you're listening to this, and of course, just in general, enjoying more episodes as they come out. I appreciate every one of you for being here. Thank you so much. Until next time, I'm out of here. Bye.